Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, we are going to be talking about the major economic issue of the day, namely Donald Trump's trade wars, multiple, plural, trade wars, I should say. But first, we wanted to continue the initiative that we started last week, namely to kind of start off the podcast by trying to catch up on the various items of news that are happening, not all of which we can address in full in the podcast, but in our current era, there is much to talk about, and we thought we'd try to at least air out a couple topics before we get to the main one we wanted to talk about. And the first one that came to mind, Adam, is something that's very close to home for you. We've talked about Columbia University before and the protests for which Columbia became a kind of epicenter during the Israel war in Gaza. There has been another turn in developments in Colombia, namely with the arrest of one particular protester, Mahmoud Khalil. Mahmoud Khalil was a recent Columbia student who graduated, has since received a green card, making him a permanent resident of the United States. But he was arrested at the behest of the Trump administration and is now facing potential deportation explicitly because of his political activities at Columbia. This has led to an outroar among those on the left, including the Democratic Party in the United States. And the claim is centered around free speech and the question of whether Khalil's activities should be protected by America's free speech laws. And I wonder whether you think this is the right lens through which to be looking at what's going on here. I mean, I raise that question because, you know, the suggestion is that there's something, you know, hypocritical that the U.S. government is engaging in, but that doesn't even seem to be, to me, the terms that the Trump administration is doing what it's doing here. In other words, the accusation of hypocrisy is sort of potentially irrelevant when what the Trump administration is doing is sort of, it seems to be more a question of authoritarianism, you know, so deciding the exception to freedom of speech in that way. So, you know, is this kind of revealing the limits of the kind of liberal conception of freedom of speech and freedoms in general?
I mean, obviously, I've been confronted with this very much close up, and you know, the situation on Columbia campus right now is miserable. It's really a grim atmosphere. I think there are like three different levels to this. There is a kind of legal procedural issue, which is the tension between the First Amendment free speech rights in the US, which at one level are extremely strong and have traditionally, through to the 2010s, been upheld very vigorously by Columbia's university administration, notably under President Bollinger, who was a noted scholar of the First Amendment and a vigorous defender of its application also on campus. And on the other hand, what's called, what is the Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which requires educational institutions to respond to harassment on the basis of race or national origin, and to ensure that students have a space in which to study where they are not, you know, they don't find themselves in what's known as a hostile environment. And since the 2010s, that Title VI protections have been interpreted as curtailing speech. And that is a fundamental dilemma of jurisprudence on free speech in the United States. It doesn't just affect Columbia or this particular student or the particular issues that are at stake. But it would be kind of, I think, kind of absurdly abstracting from the reality of the situation to ignore the fact that Khalil is caught up in, you know, the politics of Palestine and Israel and Zionism and anti-Zionism in the United States at this moment. Columbia has been in the crosshairs of that conflict, not just since October 7th, but for a long time, but with real intensity since October 7th. As far as I understand, and I'm not close enough to the movement to really judge this, but he served as a vital interlocutor between the university administration and the student protesters. And I gather on the most radical wing of the student protest movement, he's actually seen as a moderate, as somebody who is willing to compromise in ways that many people in the movement are actually uncomfortable with. But he was a prominent member of various negotiating teams, obviously himself deeply committed to the Palestinian cause. And that puts him in harm's way. That puts him in harm's way in the current moment, whether with regard to the university administration, the trustees of the university, the very powerful and vocal pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli mobilization, both on our campus and across the country, and indeed worldwide. And then the third layer of this is MAGA, which is hostile to universities as such, to liberal universities as such. They quite reasonably see us as bastions of American liberalism to which they're opposed. And in a sense, I think what's happening here is that we then have this convergence. Maybe there's a fourth level here, which is politics on immigration, which after all is the key issue at stake here, is whether somebody on the green card enjoys any degree of protection at all, or whether their status in the United States is essentially at the whim and the behest of whoever decides to exercise power. I think the legal basis I'm not even sure it's right to call it an arrest. I mean, lots of people are just calling this a kind of disappearance, because it's not clear that the people who detained him knew what legal status he was in the United States under. I think they thought he was on a student visa rather than a green card. They detained him anyway, whisked him off to some ICE, detention center in Louisiana, for God's sake. And his legal team for a while struggled to actually locate where he was in the American system. So I think, in a sense, you're right to say this goes beyond free speech. I think there is a kind of kernel of free speech jurisprudence stuff there in the tension between First Amendment and Title VI. But then, in this case, it's cross-cut by these three other dimensions: the struggle over the Palestine question, MAGA's campaign against universities, and the desire on the part of certain conservative xenophobic tendency in American politics in general, but particularly pronounced in the Trump administration, to crack down on undesirable immigrants.
Yeah, we will see where this heads. Curious to see if Colombia remains in the news in the months ahead, but obviously we will check in on that as events develop. But I wanted to ask about another topic in the news that we won't be able to expand on this week. But I noticed that Mark Carney is the new Prime Minister of Canada. Carney is someone who's come up on the podcast before. We've talked about other work he's been engaged in. He's a former public servant, former leader of central banks in Canada and Britain. I don't know, actually, Adam, whether you know him personally. I forget if that's come up or just someone you're familiar with.
No, I've met him. I've met him a couple of times at Davos. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So someone, again, who's come up on the podcast, and I'm curious what sort of leader you think he'll be based on his background. And could you tell us a bit more about his background?
I mean, he's a tough nut. Like I've done a lot of chairing in my life, and Mark Carney is a handful. Not because he's in any way uncooperative or unprofessional on stage, or takes excessive amounts of time or anything like that, but just because he is a force, and he gets his own way, and he doesn't tolerate. I think he decided I was just completely incompetent, which again doesn't happen to me all that often. It was quite something, yeah. So
what were you talking about? What was?
It was just chairing like this extraordinarily distinguished panel of central bankers, and I think he felt I wasn't entirely, up to speed. There was Kuroda-san of the Bank of Japan was on the same panel, and it was high level stuff. So I got a little bit of coaching from Carney. I don't envy his staff, to be honest. But we're close contemporaries. He's a kind of classic product of Anglo-American, Anglo-Canadian American, elite economics, business formation. He was studied at Harvard in the late 80s. He did a PhD in economics in Oxford. He then did a stint at Goldman Sachs in their offices all over the world: London, Tokyo, New York, Toronto. He's ambitious. This is one thing that's very clear, along with the competence and the drive. He's a man with burning ambition. He was deputy governor of the Bank of Canada from 2003, and then he was governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, which is the period of the financial crisis. And on the back of that, then, in a very unusual move, I mean, he truly is this kind of cosmopolitan figure. He was governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 20. You might say, hang on, isn't he Canadian? Well, white Commonwealth type things are going on here for sure in the Anglo-Canadian relationship. But he actually I think he got British citizenship by way of the Bank of England job, but his family is Irish Canadian, and so he has an Irish passport. So before Brexit, he was an EU citizen. He managed the Bank of England quite successfully as an outspoken critic of Brexit, and then as the manager of the fallout from Brexit in the Bank of England, he walked a very, very fine line, but actually managed to keep the wheels on the bus. So despite the criticism he received from the pro-Brexit people for his stance, I mean, they actually owe him thanks for the way in which I thought he was really kind of fascinating and quite exemplary in the way he basically said, look, I know where I stand on this. And in my position as a central banker and as business, economist, I can't pretend I think Brexit is anything other than a terrible idea. But my job is as a central banker, is not to curtail democracy by using financial markets, but in fact to provide the services of the central bank to stabilize financial markets, whatever incredibly stupid decision you electors may choose to make. And he did that. He carried through on it. He actually, as it were, stabilized financial markets in the wake of the crisis. I thought it was quite an interesting display of what central banks could do in a cooperative way in relation to democratic processes, even if on the substance one profoundly disagrees. After finishing at the Bank of England, there's been a sense that he's been kind of knocking around looking for the next big job. There were rumours that he might be a candidate for the IMF position, but that traditionally goes to a proper European, and they were looking for a woman to fill the role. So Christine Lagarde did it for a while. So that wasn't an option. And then Kristeva took over. So his options were blocked in that direction. He was in the private sector, and then he emerged as the head of GFANS, the Glasgow Coalition of Private Finance for Climate Politics, where he really was the kind of figurehead poster boy of blended finance. There were $133 trillion in assets waiting to pile into green causes, was the promise at the Glasgow COP. That has subsequently disintegrated. And Carney and team have had an incredibly hard time holding that together with, the move against ESG in America. And so my sense was it was only a matter of time before he started to position himself for a run at the Canadian premiership. That was probably the job in the end that, that was the most fitting conclusion for the sort of extraordinary career that he's had. He will be tough for the Americans to deal with. This guy is like, he'll make mincemeat out of the second raters in the Trump team. It's just like, it'll be a bloodbath if they ever actually confront each other, because he just doesn't take prisoners. It's made quite clear that, Canada's not going to put up with this BS. He's referred to the, Trump's tariffs as the Voldemort figure of by which he means that one shouldn't even dignify the politics of the United States right now with an explicit mention or discussion. One should just make clear that one opposes it, and Canada will stand up for its sovereignty. This, extraordinary American talk about incorporation of Canada is really beneath contempt. It's a display of really extraordinary disrespect. The task that he has beyond, one shouldn't think of Canadian politics as merely a reflex to America. The actual problem that Canada faces, which was undermining the Trudeau premiership and was really posing the question of where Canada goes next, is the state of the Canadian economy, which since 2008 has grown in a very lackluster way and has been overshadowed by US growth, which may, of course, be a sugar high on the American side, but nevertheless, the prospects for the Canadian economy are far bleaker than they ought to be. It's too dependent on, an ongoing real estate bubble. There are really quite fundamental questions about its future. We should do a proper segment about it, because Canada has obviously acquired a kind of a whole new salience, new relevance through this confrontation. But it's also just in and of itself fascinating, because in so many ways an exemplary cosmopolitan society, but one that's under strain from the failure of the growth machine, and therefore, being subject to very powerful pressures, and after all has its own internal Trumpy wing. In fact, until Trump totally turned the tables and made resisting America into a national issue, Canada's domestic Trumpists were, very much on the march. So fascinating story, but very interesting to watch, and we should return to it.
Yes, I'm definitely planning or hoping that we will do a segment on Canada. I'm sort of waiting for Carney to call the election. And as that election nears, I think that would be the right time. I mean, we'll see how Carney does as an election campaigner, I guess. I do think of him as a kind of personification of, technocratic politics in some ways. I guess we'll see how he does on the campaign trail himself. But clearly, one of his main responsibilities will be dealing with the Trump administration, as you said. And that brings us to our data point that is $4 trillion. That is the amount of money, at least earlier this week, that had been wiped off of U.S. stock markets in response to Donald Trump's various trade wars that he has initiated. He has raised tariffs against multiple countries on various kinds of items, lashing out in various directions, rescinding tariffs, threatening to reimpose them, imposing them on allies as well as competitors or adversaries, from China to Canada to Mexico. Now Europe is in the targets as of this morning, a threatened 200% tariff on wine.
About now, the EU slapping that 50% tariff on American whiskey, so the president threatened to hit back with a 200% tariff on all alcohol from the EU.
Breaking news from Donald Trump. He has woken up and tweeted on his Truth Social. If this tariff is not removed immediately, the US will shortly place a 200% tariff on all, and here we go into capitals, wines, champagnes, and alcoholic products coming out of France and other EU-represented countries.
Anyone who had been wondering whether tariffs would be just a threat or not seems to have been disabused of that notion. The trade wars seem to be a very serious part of Trump's plans for his term. So we thought we'd take a closer look. And to start off with, Adam, Trump is very fond, and had been, including on the campaign trail, he's fond of citing President William McKinley as inspiration for his tariffs policy. And I thought I'd ask what we can learn from McKinley's experience as president of the United States, and what light would that shed on our present moment right now?
Yeah, it's really funny, isn't it? One can't help wondering how long it'll be before there's like a rap musical about McKinley. There was that Hamilton moment in American politics where everyone was reading was it Cherno's Hamilton biography? And now we have this McKinley thing going on. It's very strange. I mean, because McKinley was... I mean, you can see the analogy. It's just impossible really to comprehend how on earth this late 19th century American imperialist could really be the plausible, inspiration for a 21st century president. But there it is. I mean, McKinley, as a Republican member of Congress, was responsible for the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890. He was dubbed the Napoleon of protection. I mean, it's always striking to me that 19th century American politics was sufficiently historically literate to cite figures like Napoleon as inspiration. It was quite common in the 1890s. So it's hard to imagine Trump today, reaching so high. But in any case, this extraordinary tariff was passed, 50% rate increase. And the consequence was, then as now, a disaster for the US economy. We saw the panic of 1893, which was the worst financial crisis until the Great Depression, arguably. Double-digit unemployment numbers, we think, for much of the 1890s, setting the stage for very serious social stress in the United States, leading up to the populist rebellion of 1896, led from within the Democratic Party, a disaster for the Republicans in the midterms in the early 1890s, and then the loss of the presidency as well to the Democrats. So on the face of it, a very strange example to be citing as inspiration for your tariff policy. Also, a tariff policy that was originally designed, according to McKinley's, co-promoter of the tariff bill of 1890, James G. Blaine, who saw it explicitly as a mechanism for exercising pressure on Canada, with a view, in fact, then as well to forcing the Canadians to see reason and to join the American Union, so as to avoid, that there was a deep American resentment at the fact that the Canadians enjoyed the benefits of close economic alliance with the United States, but continued to flag wave and promote their British patriotism by flying the British flag and declaring their loyalty to Queen Victoria. And the Republicans, American nationalists, didn't want to have anything to do with this. And it backfired. I mean, it didn't work. Instead, it provided Canadian politicians in the 1890s with precisely the ammunition they needed to run on patriotic nationalist platforms. And in fact, by the turn of the century, to consolidate their relationship with Britain rather than drifting into the orbit of the United States. So you could almost argue that the McKinley tariff helped to lose Canada for the United States rather than the other way around. So all of this really kind of historical bankruptcy, except you could argue in a sense that perhaps in the end, the most significant way in which Trump and McKinley converge is in McKinley's imperialism. I mean, he was the president of America's entry onto the stage of global power, war against Spain in the Western Hemisphere, an expansionist in this sense. Perhaps this is the deeper inspiration for Trump. But even if you go down that route, what's really interesting is how ambiguous the legacy was, because by the end of his career in politics, which was cut short after all, McKinley had come around to a view which was not as simplistically protectionist at the beginning of his career. And it is under McKinley that America adopts the open door policy in 1899 with Secretary of State John Hay, formulating America's principles for the patronizing, external, sovereignty infringing control of China, but nevertheless doing so on the basis of open door. In other words, trying to secure equal access for all external players of the imperialist system in a China that was going to be subjected to, if you like, external control. So still a model of imperialism, but open door imperialism, as opposed to the sort of naive, crude, bludgeoning nationalist version that was characteristic of the earlier phase of the 1880s and 1890s. So, as one would expect, not actually in any serious way a very promising example, unless Trump suggests that he's going to rapidly develop towards a far more sophisticated understanding of American power. Otherwise, I think we just have to treat this as the sort of ridiculous pastiche that it is.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think we can assume that Trump's historical literacy is not, that he's not deep in the archives.
Not in the weeds. No,
yeah.
I don't think so. No, I think this is just like, there was some dude.
Yeah.
People wonder why he doesn't prefer Teddy Roosevelt, who in many ways might seem like a more obvious inspiration.
Well, to bring things back to the present, I mentioned U.S. stock markets fluctuating pretty dramatically in response to Trump's policies. I'm curious how we should think about the stock market and the information it conveys. I mean, what kind of signal is this exactly? What kind of information do stock markets communicate in the first place?
I mean, what the stock market is basically saying is that they got it wrong. They were enthusiastic about Trump's victory last autumn. They thought that this promised tax giveaways and a pro-business agenda for the United States. It fed what was then called the American exceptionalism narrative that was also powered by, the AI, NVIDIA kind of story that we've spoken about previously on the show. And all of that has kind of crumbled somewhat in 2025. We've seen the DeepSeek kind of hit to the AI story, and we've seen action by the Trump administration that just defies economic logic in a reasonable way. Like the Canadian, Mexican, China tariff push affects about $1.4 trillion worth of goods imports to the United States. And contrary to the Trump line, this is actually most likely going to be a tax on American consumers and American businesses. The efforts by Walmart to transfer this to their Chinese suppliers have got them into trouble with the Chinese authorities, who saw this coming from a mile away and said, nope, what you're not doing is imposing the insanity of your economic policy on producers in China. You cannot, demand price cuts from them so as to offset the effects of the tariffs that your government is imposing. And it's not good for business, and the markets reflect this. The profit expectations of American business are lower under a scenario with tariffs than without, and it's as simple as that. What we're not seeing so far is a disorderly market. So, and this is important to understand about financial markets, if prices are going down, what this generally means is that people are buying and selling at lower prices, and for every person who's selling, which helps to drive the price down, there's somebody buying after all. And so we're not in the situation in which it's all sellers and no buyers. That would be a disorderly market. And then you tend to see sort of Wile E. Coyote kind of moments where you go over the cliff and then all of a sudden, you just plunge to the ground. We're very, very far away from that kind of situation. So what's going on is simply a kind of rebalancing of portfolios where people who probably made considerable profits on the upswing of the market have concluded that there really isn't any more profit to make and they don't fancy riding the escalator down. And folks, on the other hand, who are relatively more optimistic about the medium-term prospects or feel that they missed out on the stock market when it was going up, are attempting to buy the dip. I mean, they're trying to find the bottom. They're trying to spot the moment at which some of the stocks which are being offloaded might be attractive for new entrants, and that's the kind of reshuffle that's going on. But it's a judgment by the markets on the performance of Trump and of Tesla, of course, of Musk, who's a very important symbolic figure for a certain sort of tech booster, tech optimist in the American markets, and the chatter that accompanies market making and trading in the US.
Got it. I mean, and so it's a judgment not only about the immediate effects of the tariffs, but it's, I guess, also a judgment of the medium term and the sort of long term. I mean, Trump keeps saying that there will be some short-term pain.
Oh, for heaven's sake. No, I mean, that's just that's the slightly more rational version of the full-on, the big lie version is, we had a terrible economy, which we inherited from Biden, and it's going to take us some time to fix it. Like, that's the full-on big lie, right? When the Trump people got online and run that line, because this is contrary to all known data which show the opposite, right? So then the fallback position is we're shifting gear, and so there's going to be some crunching of gears in the meantime. But it's just silly, because the world after you impose the tariffs is not better, it's worse, and it will be worse forever than it is now. And that's, in a sense, what the market adjustment is reflecting. It's just going to be a worse world because you self-mutilated, because this is self-harming. It's really incredibly difficult to point to any substantial part of the American economy other than the narrowest conceived groups that will really benefit from these tariffs. The very long term, 3, 4, 5 years out, you might see some new investment in the United States in these sectors. But anyone who imagines that this is going to be, even maybe in the lifetime of this Trump presidency, is just deluding themselves.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break here for now, but we will be back in a second to continue talking about Trump's trade wars. I mean, to take a closer look at Trump's claims or his motivations for this policy, it seems to be premised on the idea of bringing manufacturing back to the United States and certain kinds of manufacturing jobs. And I guess to look at it from that perspective, I'm curious what kind of jobs these tariffs could ostensibly bring back to the United States in the first place. I mean, are these jobs that the United States should want? Would this just ultimately push the United States economy lower down the value chain of production?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one you've been trying to get us to think about, in several of the episodes we've done recently, Cam. Like, what is the inherent rationale behind this protectionism, and what are the different camps involved? And I think it's important to disentangle this at this stage, because things are getting pretty messy. There is a continuity with Bidenomics and with the strategic moves within the first Trump administration on certain sectors like, chips, though Trump has actually recently been criticizing the CHIPS Act. I think we largely think simply because it was passed under Biden, regardless of the fact that it had Republican support. In any case, that's one kind of logic for doing various types of national economic policy. And the argument there is you want to have a presence in the strategic industry, and obviously you also for that need a workforce, and so you're going to, as it were, rear the jobs that are necessary. And, to get the top Taiwanese, South Korean chip manufacturers to locate in the United States, you have to build an entire infrastructure. So that's one kind of logic. And you can see that at a pinch extending to EVs, electric vehicles, once upon a time under Biden, right? The idea was the auto industry is strategic, And if the future of the auto industry is battery electric vehicles, then we need to have a position there, and we need to start building the workforce, and we need to start building the infrastructure necessary for that, or we need to accompany the existing workforce of the auto industry through the transition, and it might be painful. And then at the very bottom rung of this kind of logic would be the steel industry, where you're saying, no nation can be free and proud and macho and build big stuff, heavy stuff, unless it's got a steel industry. And so we need to protect the American steel industry and the workers who work there. And maybe at the absolute outer limit of this, you'd have the shipbuilding obsession, and America needs to be able to build really big ships, and it needs to be able to build more, and it can't currently build hardly any. And so therefore we need to, do various types of subsidy and protection. So that's a logic which answers your question emphatically. Yes, Cam, we definitely want all of these jobs. We want chip jobs, we want car jobs, we want steel jobs, we want ship jobs. So that's a simple answer. When you do like a general tariff against Canada, it's far, far less obvious, or a general tariff against China. And then you go around like we've had Besant saying, access to cheap goods is not the essence of the American dream. The American dream is rooted in the concept that any citizen can achieve prosperity, upward mobility, and economic security. This is, again, this move where you're doing an economic policy of a fairly blunt kind, a general tariff, with a view ultimately to anchoring some sort of social policy vision, like what American society should be. And this is where your question really cuts, which is, are you seriously suggesting that onshoring the manufacture of T-shirts or cheap electric appliances is the realization of the American dream in this current moment? What on earth would you mean by even beginning by saying that, right? Because these are not high-paying jobs with career prospects in which you would expect to have skill advancement or the realization of human potential or something that would make an American man or woman be proud to have these jobs. The gender dimension is important, I think, here. Is like, if you're talking about jobs, where is your problem? What is your problem? And it can't be overall unemployment, because overall unemployment is very low, because the Biden economy was not a bad economy. It was a high employment economy, as Trump's was in the first administration. So America isn't in the 1970s and 1980s with chronically high deindustrialization unemployment. So when you're saying we need more jobs, who is it that's going to fill these? Well, it must be underemployed bits of the population. And it isn't the women you're talking about, because you're against any kind of family policy that would enable women with families to work more. So you must mean men. So really the story has got to be about the fact that in the 1950s, 97% of prime working age men, so that's 24 through 55, worked, and now it's closer to 90%. And so is the proposition genuinely that reshoring tough, hard-working manufacturing jobs is going to lure that missing quota of American men back into the labor market? Like, is that really the proposition? It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It's a kind of incoherent symbolic politics. And when we actually get to the level of implementation right now, it's the maddest thing anyone's ever seen in economic policy, in conceivably ever really in the conduct of large-scale economic policy by a major economic power, because this isn't for real. Trump will declare one thing, and then there's a pile of exemptions. There's right now fundamentally extraordinary little clarity about who's going to pay what for which type of import. And the only thing we know is that uncertainty is bad. And if the tariffs are for real, they're going to hurt the American economy.
Yeah, I think that's very useful because, it clarifies that this is not industrial policy. It is policy.
Something else.
Yeah. It's intended almost maybe primarily to harm others rather than...
Yeah, I think that's a key insight. Yeah, it's about bullying. It really is about the display of power and the extraction of some kind of concession. So the kind of side deals that Trump has sort of proposed with Mexico, it's interesting. Mexico's managing to stay below the radar right now, because they did some symbolic stuff about fentanyl, which made the president feel that he'd gotten somewhere. It may turn out that those side deals are really, in the end, what this is all about.
So then I'm curious what kind of light this sheds in the broader Trump agenda, what perspective that gives on the broader, post-neoliberal project that we've talked about before. I mean, this is a project to move past the era of neoliberalism and the associated policies of free trade that has even been embraced by the center left. I mean, notably during the Biden administration by Democrats. And so way that this agenda is playing out right now give any reason to at least question that broader project that this seems to be related to?
Yeah, this is so interesting. I've really been thinking about this a lot because, I was on the record as a critic of Bidenomics in part because I saw it as a deep continuity with MAGA 1.0. I mean, I rather cruelly referred to Bidenomics as MAGA for thinking people. And, the question now is like, Adam, do you really stand by that judgment in light of MAGA 2.0? Like, could you honestly say that you think Trump in this incarnation is Bidenomics for really, really unhinged people? And I'm quite set back by that. This is, as many people have remarked, this is a trade war. It's the stupidest trade war ever. So then the question is the sheer stupidity and the kind of radicalization of MAGA 2.0, is it a bug or is it a feature? If it's a bug, then what we would say, well, there is a post-neoliberal trend going on. We see it all over the world. We saw it in Trump 1 and then Bidenomics. And then Trump 2 was the continuation of that, but with the special sauce of crazy that we're getting such ample portions of right now. So you could do that argument and kind of contain what's going on. But I'm increasingly skeptical about that. So what if we think of the unhinged, symbolic, punitive, bullying, stupid, let's call it, thuggish element of this as not a bug but a feature? How do we think this through? And I think we have to come back to that riff that I developed a couple of shows back where we were talking about Trump as anti-PMC, anti-professional managerial class politics. And what we could say, I think, is that there is if neoliberalism was nothing if not a professional managerial class project, right? It was a doctrine, it was an ideology, it was in many ways kind of counterintuitive, it was a class politics that favored that group over the working class. And in a sense, the anti-PMC, anti-neoliberal backlash therefore has, if you like, two wings. And you could think of Bidenomics and the centre liberal people, I would count myself amongst their number, as the kind of seminar room version of the anti-neoliberal backlash. And it's kind of internal to the professional managerial class. We look at ourselves and go, you know what, this isn't working. It's exclusionary. It's disastrous. It produces all this inequality that's appalling. It's not self-sustaining. It's bad for the environment. It's an internal reform project within the PMC elite to rethink. And as much as the Bidenomics people, in often really cloying ways would describe themselves as, going to meet the American people where they are, or Sullivan's, foreign policy for the American middle class, not by or of, but for the American middle class. Ultimately, it remains a PMC project. And the interesting thing about Trump is that this is the cheeseburger, Diet Coke, Mar-a-Lago, long day of golf, and I'm now going to sound off about Canada and Mexico and God knows what else out there. He doesn't drink. The interesting thing about Trump is that, the least MAGA thing about Trump is he doesn't drink. But the MAGA 2.0, I think, exposes the fact that the anti-neoliberal element of Trump is an anti-PMC. It's a genuine rejection in that sense of both the class base and the ideology that went with it, in favor of something much rawer, something no less, of course, privileging of certain sorts of business, but more plebeian in its understanding, and above all, targeting the seminar room. And listeners may think I'm obsessing about universities right now, but it's pretty hard not to if you work in an American university at the current moment, because what MAGA is doing is, if you like, targeting the universities as institutions of the PMC, both generative of the original neoliberal project, the kind of Larry Summers of this world, which Trump, of course, doesn't want to have any business with. And on the other hand, the woke liberal and, at some level, the Bidenomics version of the anti-neoliberal scheme, which is co-targeted. And so you have this division, if you like, within the neoliberal camp, the anti-neoliberal camp, which is on the one hand a seminar room style post-neoliberal politics, which Bidenomics was the expression of. And it's, not for nothing, Jake Sullivan has just literally gone off to a position at the Kennedy School at Harvard, like settling back into the frame of the university system. And the cutting edge of MAGA right now is tariff politics on the one hand, and then an all-out assault on the PMC elements of the American state machine, the Department of Education, the statistics, bureaucracy, the USAID, and now leading research universities, which are being directly targeted on a variety of different grounds, on the anti-Semitism tip, but also just on vaccines, on foreign aid. I mean, Hopkins is losing hundreds of millions of dollars in government funding because they are associated with USAID and the project of spreading global knowledge and global expertise from America to the wider world. So I think that for me has emerged as the way of understanding the alignment and disalignment between these two moves away from neoliberalism.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I guess the Biden effort was an attempt at reform from within the managerial class, and Trump represents more of a revolution.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not comfortable with this talk about, I think Americans really moved rapidly to this revolution talk. I mean, I think it's just resentment fueled. It's kind of a stamping out. It's more, I mean, if you said to me waging a war, I'd be more happy. Maybe I'm splitting words. Maybe this is a semantic. Maybe that's what we mean. But it's certainly it's an attempted overthrow, maybe.
Well, I guess I would want to end by maybe returning to where we started in our conversation with McKinley. I mean, I think you pointed out the two parts of McKinley's agenda, namely these economic tariffs as a mainstay of his economic agenda, and then this imperialist agenda in his foreign policy. And we see the same thing as you suggested with Trump. And I'm curious whether there's a deeper connection between those aspects of policy. I mean, does protectionism go hand in hand with aggressive foreign policy? Should we be thinking of mercantilism and imperialism as a kind of package that is not easily separable?
I mean, reformist left liberals have always thought so, right? That's core to, I'll say, our shtick. Like, that's always been the argument. Starting from, I'm going to be totally anachronistic to refer to Adam Smith this way, but starting in the 18th century, which was when the idea of mercantilism began to be coined as a criticism of the policies developed by European states, starting with the Spanish imperial state as it conquered Latin America and monopolized trade with Latin America with the famous galleon convoys that entirely monopolized trade with Latin America, which then the British privateers would attempt to break up. Britain's own mercantilist politics, which begin with Oliver Cromwell during the revolutionary period. France under Louis XIV also then adopting a mercantilist program. Mercantilism, we should say, is a politics directed towards maximizing the acquisition of gold through trade surpluses. So it's a politics quite like a kind of Trump misunderstanding of foreign trade, where a trade surplus is good and a trade deficit means you're being taken advantage of. Whereas, of course, most liberal economists would say it's the other way around. A trade deficit means you're getting foreign goods for the exchange of promises to pay, and an export surplus means you're giving foreigners goods which they want in exchange for future promises to pay. And that kind of critique of mercantilism is one of the founding, causes of liberal economics in the 18th century, and then prevails in Britain in the 1830s and 1840s, where what you get, and I think this is perhaps a useful distinction, is the kind of hustling, brutal, aggressive combination of imperialism and mercantilism, monopoly, and also the extension of empire by violence, replaced in the 19th century, forgive this somewhat saccharine reading, but by a more self-confident empire, established, if you like, empire dominance, mid-19th century Victorian British dominance, which relaxes into a highly profitable business of free trade, of course, under British conditions. So you might distinguish, if you like, aggressive imperialism from, which goes hand in hand with various types of mercantilist protectionist strategy, from phases of self-confident hegemony of empire rather than imperialist wrangling, which are more congenial to free trade and a more capacious understanding of self-interest, ultimately. And there would be two phases of this that would tell this story. So we'd have the early modern phase of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, replaced by a British hegemony in the 19th century, in which the British Empire presided over free trade, disrupted in the late 19th century by a new era of imperialism and imperialist conflict, in which tariffs and protectionism, notably in the American case, but also in Germany and in Russia, went hand in hand with violent struggle. Succeeded then, of course, in the classic age of American hegemony after World War II, with a new phase of dominance, of power, of American preeminence, which then again sees its self-interest as best served by a liberal policy of free trade, and stable rules-based order, as we now like to call it, which goes through crisis in the 70s, but then reestablishes itself. And on this reading, you would then see America's sort of atavistic return to McKinley-style aggressive protectionism and Trump's outlandish claims on Panama and Denmark and Canada as being a confirmation of the fact that it's in moments of weakness, when hegemony is crumbling, that a player like the United States reverts to this kind of brutalism. Admittedly, this is a story told from the position of a kind of liberalism, but it's a coherent historical narrative which many people have found satisfying as a way of trying to tell this story.
Yeah, it suggests that if sort of Trump is motivated by sort of deeper historical causes, that whoever is his successor may continue with some combination of these policies.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is this idea of underlying continuity between the Trump, Biden and Trump presidencies. But I mean, it has to be said that the antics of this first phase of Trump 2.0 are stretching any claims to continuity at this point. I mean, we've really never seen anything quite like this, which is why I think we need to add in this component of the decomposition of the American ruling elite, which I've been harping on in different ways. But there's something broken here, which means that we can have the crew that are running the United States at this point, this gang of essentially fundamentally unqualified people who are united by craven, loyalty to the president, to Trump, and by what appears to be, on the face of it, essentially a negative, destructive agenda with regard, at least, to American state power, and it now seems towards the institutions like the big universities that ultimately support that. I mean, it really is worth saying that I think that it's unprecedented in American history for an administration to kick off by assaulting the research funding of, I mean, at this point, a majority of America's leading universities appear to be in the crosshairs of the campaign.
Yeah, there certainly is something broken when policy is being run the way it is. I wonder if some element of it is also Trump's own distinct psychology. I keep thinking of Emperor Wilhelm II, the way some of these policies get announced, the distinct narcissistic psychology.
I know what you mean, but but it's very unfair to Wilhelm, I think.
that I think maybe we should do a segment on Wilhelm. I mean, that would actually be
by all means. I think that'd be fun, because the analogy is quite strong, right? And the analogy is often invoked. This is one of the really popular is the Thucydides trap, and the Thucydides trap in question would be weak declining power trying preemptively to contain a major challenger, and it would be very interesting to talk that through. So the Graham Allison thesis, or the analysis that Graham Allison made, it would be quite interesting to discuss.
Well, we'll leave this conversation off here for now, but as always, back next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.